Picture yourself wandering the marble halls of imperial Rome in 67 AD. The sun beats down on the Forum, senators mutter in the shadows, and statues of dead gods cast long, motionless gazes across the crowd. In the center of it all walks the most powerful man in the world, Emperor Nero. Draped in purple robes, gold glinting from every edge of his attire, he moves with theatrical precision, as though every step is a performance. Beside him floats a young woman, graceful, elegant, veiled in translucent silks and adorned with sapphires and pearls. Her face is delicate, almost ethereal, her eyes downcast, yet hauntingly familiar to anyone who once saw Empress Poppaea Sabina. But here's the thing. Poppaea has been dead for 2 years. This isn't some ghost conjured by incense and wine-fueled hallucinations. This young woman is real, breathing, walking. But she is not who she appears to be. Her name once was Sporus, a teenage boy born into obscurity, later freed by imperial favor. But what he became was something else entirely, a living monument to Nero's grief, obsession, and madness. In the court's whispered corners, people call him the doll, the ghost bride, or simply her. What you're about to hear is not a love story. It is not even a tragedy in the classical sense. It is a slow descent into imperial insanity, a portrait of power so absolute it blurs the lines between love, death, identity, and domination. It is the story of how a grieving emperor, shattered by guilt and isolation, tried to remake the past in flesh and bone. But to understand how a boy became an empress, you must first understand the woman he was forced to replace. Poppaea Sabina was more than just beautiful. She was political fire wrapped in velvet. The second wife of Nero, she held sway not only over his heart, but over matters of state. She was sharp, calculating, and dangerous, everything the young emperor admired and feared. While others bowed and whispered, Poppaea dared to challenge him, to tease him, even to mock his theatrical performances when she thought them beneath his supposed talent. She wielded her influence with poise. While Nero bankrupted the treasury on banquets and chariot races, Poppaea was building a faction within the palace. She was securing allies, making enemies vanish, and bending imperial power to her vision. She knew the risk. She played the game. But even a queen cannot outmaneuver a god. In the year 65 AD, in what began as a routine marital argument, some say over his absence, others over his obsession with public image, Nero snapped. Poppaea was pregnant at the time. He struck her. Whether it was a single blow or a storm of rage, ancient sources agree on one thing. The empress never stood up again. She died that night, along with Nero's unborn heir. And something in him died with her. What followed wasn't mourning, it was delusion. Nero refused to cremate her as Roman custom demanded. He embalmed her body and entombed it in a mausoleum meant for gods. He wept over her corpse, spoke to it for hours, screamed at it to wake. He declared her divine, demanded his court continue addressing her in the present tense, and left her seat vacant at feasts. Then he found Sporus, a boy, a palace-born freedman, maybe 14 or 15 years old, intelligent, well-groomed, and with a face that mirrored Poppaea's so closely it stunned even jaded senators. The eyes, the cheekbones, the air of quiet grace. For Nero, It was not a coincidence. It was fate, a gift from the gods, a chance to undo the one act he could never reverse. And he would take that chance, no matter the cost.
To the outside world, it must have seemed like grief had finally cracked Nero's already fragile mind. But within the walls of his golden palace, what began was not grief, it was resurrection. Or at least the illusion of it. Nero summoned his physicians, not to heal, but to remake. Sporus wasn't asked. He wasn't invited into this vision. He was chosen, selected for his resemblance, his silence, and his powerlessness. The Emperor of Rome ordered one of the most grotesque surgeries in the ancient world, the castration of a teenage boy to transform him into a woman. This wasn't just mutilation, it was the destruction of identity. In ancient Rome, to be castrated was not just a physical violation, it was social erasure. A boy like Sporus, once educated for administrative service, was now to be emptied of future, of family, of name. All so he could become a breathing replacement for a woman long buried in alabaster. We don't know what Sporus thought during this time. No letters remain, no diary, no whisper of his inner voice. All we have are actions, his forced silence, his compliance, and the records of a court that regarded him less as a person than an imperial ornament. The surgery would have been agonizing. Ancient Roman medicine had no proper anesthesia. The procedure was brutal, imprecise, often fatal. If infection didn't kill you, the trauma might. Sporus survived, and that survival became his curse. Once recovered, the transformation deepened. He was given a new name, Sabina, the same as Poppaea. It was not a suggestion, it was imperial decree. He was to eat like her, dress like her, walk like her. He would speak in a higher tone, hold his hands a certain way, tilt his head just so, because that's how she did it. Every movement was monitored, trained, corrected. Imperial stylists created gowns to hide what the scalpel could not. Jewelers repurposed Poppaea's personal collection to adorn Sporus's frame. Hairdressers spent hours sculpting his curls into elaborate designs, using silver combs and golden pims once worn by the empress herself. And the mirrors, they were everywhere. Large polished bronze sheets positioned in his quarters, reflecting a face that was no longer his own. Makeup artists taught him how to shade his cheeks, darken his lashes, rouge his lips, not for beauty, but for mimicry, for illusion. The most disturbing part wasn't the external transformation, it was the psychological rewriting. Tutors instructed him in feminine posture, in courtly etiquette, in how to glance downward and defer at the right moment. Voice coaches rehearsed with him for hours to modify his tone and inflection. He wasn't just playing a part, he was being overwritten. The palace staff was instructed to treat Sporus as if he were the empress reincarnated. Servants bowed to him. Senators nodded respectfully as he passed. Even members of the imperial guard, hardened by years of conquest and bloodshed, were ordered to refer to him in the feminine, to offer protection as they once did Poppaea. And through it all, Nero watched. Every day he inspected Sporus's progress. He would sit for hours, observing him at meals, during fittings, during music lessons. Sometimes he would smile softly, whispering, "Yes, that's how she moved." But this wasn't love. This was ownership, a conquest of identity. Nero wasn't reviving Poppaea. He was crafting a puppet, one he could control completely, one that wouldn't argue, wouldn't criticize, wouldn't carry ambition in her eyes. He was building a fantasy, carved from grief and cemented by power. Then came the wedding.
Spring of 67 A.D. The Roman court buzzed with a surreal mix of anticipation and dread. Nero, emperor of the known world, had announced his intention to marry. Not a noblewoman, not a foreign princess, but Sporus, a boy, a ghost, a replacement. The wedding was scheduled to coincide with one of Rome's grand religious festivals, an act not just of blasphemy, but of psychological warfare against Roman tradition. Nero wanted the spectacle to be unforgettable, and it was. The imperial hall was transformed into a garden of grotesque beauty. Thousands of imported lilies and violets lined the marble columns. Bronze fountains spewed wine instead of water. Servants in silken robes moved silently, their faces painted white like death masks. At the center of it all stood Sporus, now Sabina, draped in a gown of pure gold thread, sewn by imperial seamstresses over the course of months. His veil shimmered with imported pearls. Around his neck hung Poppæa's own wedding necklace, a gift once given in love, now repurposed in madness. The high priest, trembling under the weight of the moment, read the marriage rites with a strained voice. Nero stood proud, dressed in ceremonial crimson, holding Sporus's trembling hand. They exchanged vows. They shared bread. They signed scrolls declaring their union legal under Roman law. But none of this was real. The guests, senators, generals, foreign dignitaries, clapped, smiled, toasted. But beneath every polite nod was disbelief and fear. For to show disapproval was treason. To call this a farce was death. Some ancient sources say Nero cried during the ceremony, that he whispered to Sporus not as a new lover, but as if Poppæa herself had returned. "You came back to me," he said once, brushing a curl from Sporus's forehead. "Even the gods couldn't keep me from you." After the wedding, Sporus was given all the privileges of an empress. He received his own quarters in the palace, decorated identically to Poppæa's. He had a staff of attendants, his own guards, his own treasury account. His days were filled with banquets, ceremonies, and rehearsals. Because it wasn't enough to look like Poppæa. He had to behave like her. In public, he walked beside Nero, offering quiet, practiced smiles. In private, he listened to the emperor whisper memories that weren't his, tell stories from a past he never lived. And he had to pretend to remember. Imagine the pressure. To live every hour as someone else. To be surrounded by artifacts of a woman you never met. To hear your name replaced, your past erased, your body reshaped. To live inside a lie so vast, it became your only reality. Sporus wasn't just playing a role, he was surviving one. Every wrong word, every hesitation could mean exile or execution. Every mistake was betrayal. So he performed perfectly. The court marveled at his poise, his grace, his obedience. They whispered about how convincing he was, how he even sounded like Poppæa when he laughed. But no one asked what he wanted. No one asked who he was before. To them, he wasn't Sporus anymore. He was Sabina, and Nero
was satisfied.
After the wedding, life inside the palace became a theater of delusion. Sporus now lived in rooms perfumed with jasmine and frankincense, the very same scents that once clung to Poppaea's skin. The walls were covered in frescoes of serene goddesses, their features subtly altered to resemble Sporus. Nero had ordered new portraits, each one more detailed, more lifelike, more disturbing. In every painting, Sporus smiled the smile Nero missed, Poppaea's smile, frozen in pigment and obsession. He was never alone. Maids followed his every step, fixing his gown, retouching his rouge, adjusting his hair. They never called him Sporus, only Domina, only Sabina. To slip up was dangerous, and fear sharpened every syllable. At banquets, Nero paraded him like a trophy. "My wife," he'd declare, arm possessively wrapped around the boy's narrow waist. Guests clapped and smiled on cue. They toasted the imperial couple with watered wine and fake admiration, while their eyes flickered with something else, pity, perhaps, or disgust, or the sheer terror of witnessing a man rewrite reality and make everyone agree it was beautiful. And Sporus? He never flinched. He bowed when expected, smiled when needed. He complimented Nero's music, applauded his poetry, and looked lovingly into the eyes of the man who had destroyed his future. Behind closed doors, Nero's need deepened into madness. Some nights he wept on Sporus's lap, begging for forgiveness from a ghost. Other nights he demanded intimacy, whispering things no child should hear, much less endure. In these moments, Nero didn't see a boy at all. He saw Poppaea, reborn, obedient, silent. Sporus had become a mirror, a reflection of loss, obsession, and guilt. And the cost was his entire self. He was not allowed to speak of his past, not allowed to remember who he had been. His books, his letters, anything that spoke of Sporus, gone. What remained was a persona forged from silk and fantasy, a walking relic. And yet, behind the layers of rouge and illusion, a spark still smoldered. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, when even the palace walls slept, Sporus would stare at his reflection in the polished silver mirror beside his bed. He would touch his face, trace the lines shaped by surgeons and stylists, and wonder, am I still there, somewhere? There are no records of his answers. What we know is this: for 2 long years he maintained the act. Not once did he break character. Not once did he slip. He became the perfect empress not because he believed in the lie, but because survival depended on it. Then, in 68 AD, the empire itself began to fracture. Rebellions erupted, the Praetorian Guard turned, the Senate whispered sedition. Nero, the god emperor, was crumbling, and the mask of divine power was slipping. But even as enemies closed in from every side, Nero refused to let go of his fantasy. When he fled Rome, Sporus rode beside him, draped in finery, even in exile. Because Nero would rather face death than leave behind the illusion of his perfect dead wife. And Sporus would follow, because he had no choice.
The villa outside Rome was quiet, too quiet for an emperor. Gone were the banquets, the orchestras, the roaring crowds. In their place, silence, broken only by whispers of betrayal echoing through marble corridors. The velvet cushions had lost their luster, the gold goblets sat untouched, and the man who once ruled 60 million souls now paced barefoot across cold stone floors, muttering to himself. Nero's world was unraveling, and Sporus was there, watching every thread come undone. The once mighty ruler no longer spoke of divine destiny or eternal glory. Instead, he rambled about escape routes, disguises,
a ship to Egypt, a tunnel to the coast, but each plan fell apart under the weight of reality. His allies had vanished, his legions had turned, his gods were silent. And still he held Sporus close, like a talisman, like a shield against the end. They say Nero began rehearsing his suicide like a play. He practiced falling on a sword. He demanded his attendants weep with the right intensity. He asked Sporus to recite lines, to play the grieving widow, as if the scene could be perfect, as if the performance could outshine the truth. But death, unlike theater, cannot be staged. When the final messengers arrived, there was no time for ceremony. Nero panicked. He trembled. He sobbed that history would remember him poorly, that no one would mourn him. And then, with the help of a servant, he drove a dagger into his own throat. The last words of Rome's mad emperor were not about conquest, not about gods, but a pathetic whisper. What an artist dies in me. And then silence. Nero was dead. And Sporus remained. What happens to a ghost when its master is gone? The boy who had been renamed, reshaped, rebuilt, he suddenly stood alone, no title, no protector, no script to follow. The man who'd forced him into this living grave was gone, and yet Sporus couldn't step back into the light. He had no old self to return to. Rome didn't free him. It didn't even recognize him. Instead, it passed him along like an inheritance, a curiosity, a trophy. First, to Nymphidius Sabinus, one of Nero's former bodyguards. He kept Sporus dressed in empress's robes, presenting him at private gatherings as if nothing had changed. Then came Otho, briefly emperor, briefly Sporus's new owner. And finally, Vitellius, whose cruelty exceeded even Nero's. With each transfer, Sporus became less a person and more a spectacle. Vitellius, eager to humiliate Nero's memory, devised something truly vile. He ordered Sporus to perform in the arena during a public festival, a grotesque parody of myth, where the empress would be raped and killed before thousands, reenacting the fate of Proserpine, goddess of innocence, dragged into the underworld. For Sporus, this was not theater. This was the final desecration. He had endured so much: mutilation, isolation, performance, obedience. But this would be the end of even the illusion of dignity. And so, on the eve of his scheduled appearance, Sporus made his final choice. He took his own life. Some say poison. Others claim he opened his veins quietly, like a Roman noble. He was not yet 21. There was no monument, no public mourning, no elegy for the boy who became an empress. But his death, like his life, was a defiance in silence, a final act not scripted by others.